in the 1930s, in North America, there was a popular totalitarian movement that people have largely forgotten about. They had huge parades. The media talked about it all the time. It was called Technocracy. And it had interesting ideas. You know, for instance, it believed that you could govern the entirety of society through social control techniques. In general, they further believed that you could have expert social engineers in charge of everything, and that would be extremely beneficent to the entirety of society. They also aligned very much the needs of social governance with the needs of industrialization, and the idea being that industrial production should be guiding the way that society works. They had like a lot of these ideas that democracy was not efficient because it's not rational, right? It's people talking at one another, and somehow like, you know, you decide something, but it's not scientific, it's not like proper engineering. So I don't know, does this sound familiar to anyone? So this is the 1930s, right? Their goal was like very much an efficient totalitarian society which would function automatically under the guidance of engineers. And in a sense, you know, they're a little bit funny. Their favorite color was gray. Like, I don't know if you've seen many political movements that had like gray as like the dominant color. Their symbol was yin-yang, I don't know why. And, you know, interesting factoid, Elon Musk's grandfather was actually a prominent member of this movement. And so, you know, they were pretty big, they were pretty intense. They talked about unifying all of North America under this like centralized technate that would like have all this good like governance based on science and engineering. But you've probably never heard of it. Apart from a few nerds in the room, you've probably never heard of it. Do you know why? Well, it's because they won. It's become so embedded in the fabric of our thinking that we don't even see it as something different, as a specific political movement. As early as 1941, James Burnham, who wrote the classic book Managerial Revolution, explained that technocracy might have disappeared. It was like, you know, as a political movement, it was almost like just 10 years long. But you know, as a movement, it wasn't there, but the power was being transferred to technicians, to managers, to experts who controlled modern technology. And so we might not know about you know, the ideas of technocracy, but they are everywhere. I still don't understand this magazine cover that they had. Apparently the robot is good. But like, it's very much the same kind of imagery and thinking that we have today around AI, right? It's this thing it's kind of scary, it's kind of big, but also, you know, it's promising work for everyone, you know, baseline salary for everyone, based on like this wonderful engineered-based management. So, you know, the world we have today is basically the same thing, right? This is a slightly revisited version of the diagrams they proposed for governance back then, and it's essentially the system we have today. A tiny group of people has like an almost unilateral say over the information we access, over our communications channels, you know, over the taxes that they levy on digital businesses, the rules of online commerce, the livelihood of media. You know, I worked in media for a long time. It's really hard. The labor conditions of millions of people, and basically the operation of all critical internet services. And so the laws that these people set in this kind of structure compete directly with the laws that we set as democracies through our governments, right? And that is what people mean when they talk about encroaching on sovereignty. That's why we need a sovereign pushback, is because our laws should matter more than theirs. So now, you know, we might be saying like, oh, they have all this power, etc. But where does it come from, right? They don't have an army. You know, they don't have like a police force. They can't like force people to do things, but yet they do have power. The power they have comes entirely from operating infrastructure. And we tend to think of infrastructure in a somewhat simplistic way. We tend to think of it as, you know, these big physical things like a railroad, a dam, you can touch it, you can see it in the landscape. But when it's abstract, when it's digital infrastructure, we tend to cease to see it. And so that's why it's important to have criteria so that we can recognize infrastructure when it appears in the digital space and it's a lot less obvious. And so the criteria are essentially If it's hard to replace, and that can be, of course, because it's a dam, lots of capital invested in that, but also it can be because of network effects. That makes things hard to replace, right? You can't take people off the network and convince them to move because that's a collective action issue, and that gives the kind of staying power that infrastructure has. So that's the first criterion. The second criterion is that to be infrastructure, it must have many downstream users. The reason for that is if you're building something that's only used by one class of people, say you're building something that's only for doctors, then that class of people can easily coordinate to have power to push back, right? All the doctors will get together and go no, that's abusive, we won't take it. But if it's something like roads, where you need it for, to visit your parents, maybe to go on a holiday, but also for freight, for business, etc. It's a much harder collective action issue to get these people to organize, and therefore that gives real staying power to the infrastructure. And third, it's infrastructure if it has governance, which means if it sets rules on the people who use it. Now, we tend not to see that because we've legislated and regulated existing infrastructure in such a way that they're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to be an electrical operator and say, you can only use this kind of light bulb that I make, and you can't use the competitions. But it used to be like that. And that's the kind of situation that we have here in tech. And this power of infrastructure isn't new. As a society, we've learned to manage it for previous iterations, but they've tended to appear progressively, right? We've started to have roads, and then maybe later we had waterways, and then later we had trains and electricity, and each time we learned how to govern it so that it would work for society over time. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't ever immediate, but we learned it. The problem with the digital space is that a lot of infrastructure happened at once. Over 20, 30 years, a ton of new infrastructure happened, and this created a sort of infrastructure shock that our governance capacity as society was unable to absorb and take over and make function as utilities. And so in order to take over, in order to push back, we need to create a reverse democratic shock to take over that infrastructure. Now, it's challenging because there's so much of it. So Francesca talked very well about the Eurostack. Previously, there's a series of reports. There's one called the European Way that's also in the Eurostack movement that starts to list all the layers. And even staying at a very, very high level, it's still social media and search and cloud and browsers and operating systems and advertising and so many other things. A lot of the time, people only think about this bottom part because it's what's closest to traditional infrastructure, connectivity, data centers, but really, most of the value and most of the power is in the higher levels, and that's what we see notably in social media and search. And so most of the threat to democracy comes from the higher layers. We need to solve all the layers, but we also need to be very careful about those higher layers. And it's challenging because it's a lot, but we really have to face the fact that digital technology is infrastructure, and that infrastructure is powerful. It shapes what runs on it, and it governs its users. And so, this is the foundational thing. And if you have authoritarian infrastructure, because it governs its users, then that leads to an authoritarian society. Especially since, as Carl Bildt has been saying, the internet is becoming the infrastructure of infrastructure. And therefore, you have this authoritarian system that is setting rules for everything. This is not a metaphor, this is not hyperbolic. We live in an authoritarian world because our digital infrastructure is captured. That's exactly where we are. So, I don't know, do we just give up? It's big, right? It's a big problem. I'm tempted not to give up. I don't think it's unstoppable. I don't think that we benefit from keeping our heads down and staying out of trouble, even though that's tempting. But the question is what really do we do? And that's where I'm going to progressively come closer to social media. This is a broad topic. I think it's the same issue across all infrastructure, but focusing on social media, we're going to get closer. First, the important thing that we need is imagination, hope, aspiration. Now, I realize that this sounds trite as fuck, but it's true. I talk to policymakers, I talk to businesses all the time. I've seen this in the media industry. One of the key problems we have is people can't even imagine a world that doesn't work the way that big tech does. And doing that work of like figuring out, hang on, like, wait, we could aspire to something better, it could work this way, it could look like this, is already a first step towards like breaking the mold and figuring out how it works. I know I tried to organize newspapers into like pushing back on how advertising works. And everyone was like, but how does that work? Like, Google makes the rules for the internet, right? That's how things work. And so that's where it failed. And so we can imagine, a completely different world where like you want your children to be on social media because it's actually good for them, because there are good spaces for them. Or we could imagine a world in which like search actually works and doesn't give like all kinds of like random, stupid slop. Or we could imagine worlds in which we actually govern how advertising technology itself works. And I'm not saying this is a utopia. This is just a place where we can have a democratic debate about how these systems work. And we're not going to like all the outcomes, but they'll be our outcomes, and we can improve them over time. We can imagine a world in which AI doesn't suck. We can imagine a world in which we have algorithmic pluralism so that the recommendations we get from sites in social and search actually have the same kind of diversity as we would expect from the rest of the media landscape, from newspapers, from TV stations. We can have browsers and operating systems that are no longer allowed to sell your data, and the way that, for instance, Chrome does. We can have, what else can we have? We can have, a sovereign cloud, as Francesca was talking about earlier, and make that simply work here in a way that cannot be extinguished or switched off. We can have open source software that's actually funded by the cloud services that it supports. I think that's a major problem that hasn't been well addressed. We could have mobile systems that actually don't enable a massive data broker industry. And by the way, if you think that iOS is protecting you from that, it's not. We could have protocols that support commerce everywhere. This exists. In India, they have this thing called Beacon Protocol, where you can buy retail and do ride-hailing, and it's all an open system that's operated by its stakeholders. We can have a world in which even artists make money, maybe on the internet. I don't know. So let's be a little bit crazy. We could have private chat for everyone. We could have a cooperative that makes deliveries that's not anti-labor. This is just my imagination. I'm not saying that this is the world that we all want. I think these are things worth wanting, and just by looking for them, we can create the possibility of breaking through to that system, because we can start thinking about the institutions we want to build to get there. Now, a common problem that I've seen, I spent 30 years in tech, and I'm now doing a lot of policy-related work, and I see a number of things where people go you just need to do X and we'll be fine. And I love these things. I love open source. I've been in open source for 30 years. But we have to stop saying, just make it open source and we'll be fine. That is not enough. Open source solves the problem of having control over the source code. That was a problem in the 90s. If you have access to the source code, but you don't have access to the infrastructure that operates it, you're just as captured. Same thing with open standards. I'm not a hater of standards. I've worked a lot in W3C. I was on the board, on the tag, et cetera, but they only help if your problem is interoperability. So every time someone says, oh, we'll just use open source and open standards, and then we'll have a European something, I'm dying on the inside, because that world is a graveyard. If open source and open standards were enough to solve our problems would be solved. We have a lot of those. Same thing, I keep hearing people say, we'll just make a digital commons. Yes, but the way real-world commons work, they have shared governance. They have the power to enforce the rules that they make. Otherwise, the commons doesn't work. Same thing with regulation. It's oh, the DMA will solve our antitrust problems. All of these are too naive. We need to start thinking much more proactively. We need to stop being care bearers about this. So imagination, less naivety, and finally, and this is where things get difficult, we need to build and take over and essentially expropriate the incumbents either by, thank you, either by building replacements or taking them over, it doesn't matter, regulating them. But we can build these systems on the tech side. It means that us technologists need to start thinking about what it means to create a toolbox of architectural components that are compatible with democratic governance. And like you can ask all the technologists in the room or elsewhere, we don't really know how to do that. A lot of us have ideas. We know systems that prevent democracy. We're not good at knowing systems that support democracy, and we can work on this more. And on the policy side, because we really need to bring the two together, we need to start designing institutions and stop hoping that technologists saying like, oh, it's decentralized is going to be enough. You know, decentralized, open source, open standards doesn't get you anywhere. It helps, but it's not enough. And if it's not enough, then we failed. And so we really need to think about institution building, because institutions is what guarantees democracy. And so, you know, if we look here at this is how social media works today. Imagine Facebook or whatever. Pick your favorite, the one you hate the most, I don't care. And basically, it takes all these responsibilities, identity, social graph, privacy, safety, et cetera, and it hides it inside a single monolith with a single governance structure over it. It has power because it controls it controls the social graph such that you can't extract it and move it elsewhere. But that basically the governance model is monolithic. It's one big block. And that is necessarily authoritarian. As a technologist, I can tell you, I can look at that and go like, yeah, that's always going to be a fascist system. There's no way out of it, right? Even if they play nice for a bit, that's always what's going to happen. And we can try to regulate it, like with the DSA and stuff like that. But like, it only goes so far, right? It corrects a few of the errors, but it's not enough. And again, you know, people keep talking about tech ethics. Ethics is great if, as a person, you want to figure out how to do good things in the world. And there's great work on ethics and technology, like Shannon Valor has done a lot of work about like virtue ethics in the technological world. But like tech ethics is powerless. It will do nothing. It's basically begging for change from big powerful companies that they're not going to give. So, you know, that is the current authoritarian system. How does democracy work? Well, it looks kind of like this. And that's good. That's what we want, right? People tend to think of like these institutional models where like there's the head of state and then ministries and stuff like that. That's not at all how democracy works. Democracy works because like somewhere here you have the head of state, and then here you have judicial power and some judges, and over here you have independent agencies, and then there's a parliament of some kind, and then there's the media here that's like doing all kinds of things, and then there's local stuff that's pushing back, and you have a system that's eventually polycentric and that has a lot of checks and balances. That's what checks and balances means. It means when you try to pull on these things, the other things pull back, and that's how we make progress. It's an endless meeting. It's annoying as fuck, but that's how democracy works, and that's the world we want, right? And so what we want out of technology is something that enables us to get to this. How do we get to this from the system we have today? So now there's a lot of progress has been made using the federated model, and we can see this is it's starting to look like a hairball. It's the beginning of a hairball. It's the evolution towards a hairball, but it's not enough. It's an important model. I think this model needs to be preserved no matter what happens, because a lot of people like it, and it brings a lot of social value. It's basically essentially connected communities that have like a smaller set of responsibilities each. The problem is, like, anchoring your identity in a community is not wonderful. You need more shared services. Shared services actually exist somewhat in the federated world. You have relays, you have things like IFTAS and FIRES. But like each instance still has too much responsibility. It's a big improvement. We need to preserve it. But like, you know, we need to evolve it and empower it to be much more centered on, to enable much more democratic forms so that we can have more of a hairball. And why am I talking about like it being complicated? This is a diagram that comes from a paper I love called Control Point Analysis by Dave Clark. And essentially he's studying a simple thing. On this side is the steps that are involved to fetch a web page, just one web page, when you see one web page. And this is the steps involved in creating a web page. Every single red bubble is a point of control. And every time there's a point of control, we have a democratic problem. Every point of control, we need a way to remove the structural power that it creates that is there. That's huge. That's for a very simple task. There's already a lot of structural control embedded in it. And that's why we need a much denser hairball in order to eliminate that power. Sometimes it's with regulation, sometimes it's with commons, sometimes it's with a market. It depends, but we need to think control point by control point. And that takes us to something that is more complex than the federated model. And so for that, we need to start thinking in terms of a toolbox. And, a lot of people like to fight over technical systems. If you've been in tech, it's been like, oh, HTTP versus Gopher if you're really old. VI or Emacs, tabs or spaces. And today we're having like a revisit of that with people going like, oh, ActivityPub, AT protocol. Like, that is terribly boring. Like, the last thing I want to see is a protocol war. I've seen like 200 my entire life. Is pick a sports team, for fuck's sake. This is not productive. This is not how we move forward. How we move forward is by looking at the properties of these different protocols and how we make them work together to get the democratic structures that we want in the world. And so, yes, we do need protocols, because when you have a protocol, it makes it possible to build like a lot of different small institutions and connect them to start getting that hairball that is democracy. We also need a clear revenue model. As technologists, we keep shipping these things, and we don't know how to make money from them. And that's a problem, because then you get like a massive volunteer burnout factory. That is not how you build a society that's sustainable. We need revenue models for everything, and we need to do that as part of the tech design. We need, and this is like slightly more contentious, but we need cryptographic primitives, and I don't mean cryptocurrencies, if anyone's like hesitating about that. We need cryptographic primitives that help us authenticate data without relying on a central authority. I know that's a lot of like tech speak, but when we have that, it means that you can move data around, and like your data can be processed by a different institution and then moved to another institution, and everyone can know that it was really the data that came from you initially without having to trust any of these institutions to do the right thing. That's a very important primitive. And finally, we also need modern institutional models. A lot of the work that we need to happen is not in technologists' hands. I keep seeing policymakers going like, oh, are you going to make that thing decentralized? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. It's what we need is people who are like, Bloomington School kind of people who can design governance systems. And like in general, when I meet with them and I explain how to break things down, not in the monolith, but like in these small bubbles, people go like, oh, hang on. We know this. That's exactly how water management works, or how the post office works, or how we have a public option for this. Yeah, and like when you get it to that level, then you have like good institution design from the people who matter. In terms of where that work is happening, that's a lot of work. There's a lot to be done. But we have multiple open communities that are working on this. The ones that I'm part of are like IndieSky and FreeRFeeds, and what we do is we're bringing together open source developers to keep building better systems, and we bring them to policy people who are designing the governance. None of this is done, but like we're already making great progress. We already have like systems. Like I see Sebastian and Jörn here in the front. Like we're talking about like moderation commons, European sovereign infrastructure, all of that. And a lot of us have like also joined forces with the Eurostack people, because I have both hats. I was both in the Eurostack and did in the social media stuff. And we're basically talking to countries about setting up sovereign social media infrastructure that is compatible with regulation and a solid foundation for democracy. So now, like, I want to start parting with, like, this may be apocryphal. I couldn't find it traced, but like, this is Clemenceau, and he's a French writer and politician. And like one day he was in a conversation with an annoying noble who kept going on about like his illustrious ancestor and his family and all that. And at some point the noble tried to like lower Clemenceau because he knew that he came not from a prestigious family. And he was like, oh, so in your family, who is the illustrious ancestor? And Clemenceau said, that would be me. And that's basically where we are today, right? If you think of governance models, if you think of democracy, there's a lot of like illustrious ancestors, Athenian democracy, the America's founding parents, the Zhao dynasty, Tianxia and all that. But when it comes to the internet, we are the illustrious ancestors. That would be us, right? And we can have like all these bricks. These are the bricks that we've started to like break apart to make them governable independently. And a lot of the technology is there. Like we're really at a point at which we need to bring them together with institutional design and with funding. And like once those bricks start connecting, we're getting the hairball back and we're getting it on the internet. It's like we're very close. And so, as American philosopher Bruce Springsteen said, it's going to be a long walk home from where we are to where we need to go. But we've let these tech companies take over society in ways that are very challenging to fix. But we should remember that happened very fast. It wasn't like that when most of us were born. And we can revert it just as fast. And we're really in what Gramsci called an interregnum, where the old is dead, but like we're figuring out how to make the new happen. And we know that we're there. So we really need to think in terms of the fact that we have a future. This is not an impossible task. It really is time to break authoritarian tech. It's time to build the democratic tech. And finally, it's time for regime change. Thank you very much.